With international media and the internet turning the world into a global village, having a universally recognised brand to all consumers is paramount to maximise sales. I mean, these companies are so neurotic about keeping it all the same, half the time they're even too stubborn to even stick an extra U in the title for us customers in the Commonwealth. Well, at least Sega still care about us. But every now and then, they have no choice to rename because of cultural offence, recent events, or in the theme of today's episode, because they're really bloody stupid and have no idea what they're talking about. But, hello you, I'm Guru Larry, and I'll welcome you to Fact Hunt. 5 games renamed for really stupid reasons. Good old Star Fox. Nintendo's seminal flying furry simulator has been the fascination of gamers, yiffers and YouTube channels trying to discredit barrel rolling memes for years. But while they scrape the barrel of endless videos as to why Fox has metal legs, because it's a bloody puppet, no one has ever asked the strange reasoning as to why Star Fox 64 was called Lilac Wars in Europe. Now, everyone knows the story as to why the original Star Fox was renamed Star Wing in Europe, because of either a ZX Spectrum game or an Atari 2600 game also being called Star Fox, or a German company called Star Vox, with a V, depending on what your source is. But the actual truth is, Nintendo's European distributor of the games were a bunch of pussies who didn't understand trademark law, so didn't want to kick up a fuss. Anyhow, I'm digressing here. We're talking about the sequel. At least the one that was released, anyway. Well, until they bundled the actual sequel with the Super Nintendo Mini Classic, Star Fox 64. With the question being, why was Star Fox 64 released as Lilac Wars in Europe? Surely it should have been called Star Wing 64, right? Well, no. Completely out of nowhere, it was actually George Lucas of all people getting a bit grumpy about the name, thought Star Wing sounded a little bit too much like Star Wars, and demanded a name change. Now, at any other time, Nintendo probably have told Lucas to piss off. It sounds nothing like Star Wars, you silly little Nicholas cretin. But this was 1997, a point when Star Wars was heating up to be a big deal again, what with the soon-to-be-released Phantom Menace being touted to be the biggest grossing movie of all time, and more likely the fact that Nintendo had secured a deal with LucasArts to develop 3 exclusive Nintendo 64 games, which ended up being Shadows of the Empire, Rogue Squadron, and the rather forgotten Battle for Naboo. So, wanting to keep in George's good books, they appeased his rather neurotic demand. Luckily, Lilac Wars was the last Star Fox game to be renamed in Europe and Australia, with even a 3DS remake going back to its original title. So we all have to credit the creative Jar Jar Binks for giving an all-time classic a really stupid name. Thanks, George. Twat. Every now and then, video games need to be renamed because a title that sounds perfectly normal in one language can be absolutely absurd in another. And that's exactly what happened to the 6th Mortal Kombat game. Now, Mortal Kombat Deception may sound perfectly acceptable to our English-hearing luggos. Deception simply means to deceive, to con. Unfortunately, Midway assumed it had the same meaning worldwide. Well, that is until they started being laughed at by French gaming journalists. Why? Because in French, the title literally translates to Mortal Kombat Disappointment. Of course, Midway refused to ever admit this was the reason why they changed the name, and just cited translation issues before rebranding it to Mortal Kombat Mystification there. Luckily for them, Mortal Kombat Disappointment was far from a disappointment. I mean, could you imagine the absolute field day journos would have had with a name like that if it was? It received 8 out of 10s all around and still holds the title of fastest selling Mortal Kombat game to this day. A few months later, Midway released a PSP version as Mortal Kombat Unchained, hoping to get it globally right at least once this time. Unfortunately, the French meaning for Unchained is complete waste of time. No, it isn't. As much fun as it is to bash Pro Skater 5 for literally destroying the franchise, we need to go back to the very first entry in the series for this silly renaming. In the pre-Tony Hawk world, skateboarding games were rather few and far between, with the only notable entries being Konami's Skate or Die series and Atari's seminal Twisty Knob arcade game 720 Degrees. However, come the mid-90s and the rise of kids desperately trying to mutilate themselves on moving planks of wood, industry stalwarts Activision saw dollars in their eyes, so developed a game, slapped the most famous skateboarding bloke they could find on a cover, and released it internationally as Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Well, I say internationally. Someone at Activision's UK headquarters decided to rename the game the rather vanilla Tony Hawk's Skateboarding. Why? Because they thought the British would assume it's an ice skating simulator. Yup, Activision had so little respect for British people's intelligence and the fact it's got a guy riding a blooming skateboard on the cover, that some fool renamed their precious new licence the bluntly descriptive Skateboarding. I mean, that's like them renaming Call of Duty to Shooting Bad People with Guns. It's also rather interesting that their thought process was just the Pro Skater part that needed renaming in the UK, as Brits would be far more familiar with Tony Hawk's the stand-up comedian, rather than some bloke who gets paid silly amounts of money to stand on a trademark branded piece of plywood. Luckily, Activision saw sense after this rather pointless exercise in rebranding and released a sequel with its global name, which it kept until completely arsing up the franchise in 2016. Oh, and any Americans out there scoffing that publishers think us Brits are stupid, please note that a few years prior, Another World was released as Out of This World in the US, as the publisher Interplay thought that you lot were too dumb to tell the difference between an acclaimed sci-fi platformer and a cancelled daytime soap opera. So let's just put it as them having very little respect for their customers' intelligence in general. I mean, how else do you explain season passes? Long-time viewers of Fact Hunt may remember I covered this story in my patents episode, or patents as some of you tried to correct me as, but the sheer absurdity of the whole situation deserves another mention. Now, Soulcalibur today is one of the final bastions of the big fighting game franchises of the past, but fans of the series may remember it was never named Soulcalibur until the second entry. The first was named Soul Blade in the West, and before that, Soul Edge in Japan and arcades. So, what's with the name change? Well, let me introduce you to Tim Langdell. This lovely chap thinks he owns the trademark to the name Edge in every video game ever made. So Namco renamed Soul Edge because of its perjurous demands. When Tim changed the name of his development company from Softtech to The Edge in the early 80s, he assumed he owned the name in the entire gaming industry. So over the next 3 decades, threatened legal action from everything from magazines to mobile games. And Soul Edge was just one of the early victims. Namco didn't want any issues with the sequel, so used the stylised Calibur, abbreviated from the legendary sword Excalibur, and have named all future titles in the series under the same moniker. Ironically, the same thing happened 8 years later to them when they had to rebrand Demon's Souls to Dark Souls. And as for Tim, Well, he got a little too trigger happy with his litigations and decided to take EA to court when they released seminal woman simulator Mirror's Edge in 2007. Needless to say, EA completely tore him apart to the point where he had to relinquish any claim of the title ever again. This upset Tim so much that he left the video game industry entirely and became a priest of all things. Probably worried that he's going to hell for being such an arsehole for the past 3 decades. Everyone loves Bomberman. It's a quintessential title to remind you how stupid you are, as evidenced by the countless times you ended up trapping yourself behind a bomb that you yourself planted. Though, what's surprising to most people is how old the franchise is. It outdates Super Mario and Zelda by at least 2 years, and never even started on a Nintendo system either. The MSX was where it began. But this tale of idiotic renaming starts with Sinclair Research, the creators of the ZX Spectrum. They wanted to license a couple of games from Hudson for their fledgling computer, so picked up Stop the Express and Bomberman. However, Sinclair didn't feel too comfortable with the name Bomberman, so decided to go with something else. Now, the reason as to why the Bomberman name was dropped in the UK is pretty poignant. The word Bomberman was entirely synonymous with the IRA in the British press at the time, and with the IRA themselves recently detonating a bomb in London's Hyde Park, killing 11 people, out of respect for those who were murdered, they went for something a little more acceptable. And when I say acceptable, I mean incredibly stupid. Sinclair couldn't have chosen a worse name. Eric and the Floaters. Yep, Eric and the Floaters. That is honestly what they rebranded the name as. Completely oblivious that the word floater is actually slang for a turd that won't flush. But it's actually in reference to the sentient balloons you need to blow up before moving on to the next level in the game. Though thinking about it, you'd honestly think a pin would be a far better device to destroy balloons. But they went for giant cherry bombs instead, because video game logic. Surprisingly, throughout the 80s, later games released in Europe would also go on dropping the Bomberman moniker. When Ubisoft took over distribution rights, they obviously realised Eric and the Floaters was a little silly to call their franchise, so used a far more respectable Dyna Blaster instead, with the series finally being globally unified as Bomberman, well, Super Bomberman, with the release of the Super Nintendo version in 1992. So from a dark reason to rename the game, to an incredibly stupid one to rebrand it as. Eric and the Floaters. Bloody hell, what were they thinking? Honestly. Hello you. Thanks ever so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe to be first to see future Fact Hunt episodes. Click on the bell if you already are to make sure you're notified, and be sure to check out my other episodes. And if you want to be super awesome, check out my Patreon. But thanks again for watching, and I'll be seeing you next time. Ta-ra for now.